Hi there, you're listening to In-Depth Film, a podcast dedicated to everything cinema. My name is Greg Bakker, and I am one of the hosts, and joined with me is my good friend and collaborator and co-host, Greg Kotze.
Cool, thanks Greg. So you may know me from my YouTube channel, Depth Cine, and myself and Greg, we've been living together for quite a while. We've known each other since university, right?
Yeah, well actually no, since high school.
Since high school, of
Yeah,
course.
we played rugby together for years, basically 5 years. And while we weren't friends in high school, we certainly spent a lot of time together on the rugby field. I think we had a few classes together, but we only really became friends when we studied film together at university.
That's right, yeah. And then that relationship sort of blossomed there a bit when we started working together, and you were doing most of the directing. I was shooting some of your stuff, short films, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And from there, our creative relationship, I guess, started to blossom.
Yeah, and I guess there was a fundamental shift as well. At least I felt it when we had finished film school. I went off into the industry to do some work, and you went off to Thailand, and then we, serendipitously found our way back together in Japan, where we ended up making our first feature. And I just remember thinking in Japan, after we'd met up, that I don't know, it just felt like there was something different, like we were kind of destined to maybe walk this road together,
Yes, and then we took this step to make our first independent feature film, which is a bit of a story in and of itself.
Yeah, we can actually do a podcast.
A separate podcast just dedicated to that.
Maybe a few podcasts.
Yeah, there are plenty of stories from that.
Yeah.
But that sort of boosted our filmmaking sort of collaboration even further.
Yeah.
And we took it from there. So today, we're just going to start off by talking about a film we saw yesterday, right?
Yes, that's true. But before we get into that, Gray, I just thought, why don't we quickly give like a very quick introduction to ourselves, kind of like a 60-second, history, personal history.
Sure.
Just so that the audience, anytime, if there are any, for example, if there are any first-time listeners, or because I'm sure people will come here from your channel, but there also might be people who just find us out of the blue.
Sure. So I'm Greg Kotze. I work in the local South African film industry. I work as a second AC, which is a camera assistant on TV commercials, feature films, TV series, that kind of work. And I also work as a DP on all kinds of jobs, a lot of documentary content. And you'll probably, if anyone knows me, it's probably from my In-Depth Cine channel, which is a channel dedicated to breaking down aspects of cinematography and related to cinematography education.
Nice. And I think it's also just worth mentioning, sorry, I'm a sucker for these details myself. So it's also worth mentioning that Gray's from Cape Town, South Africa.
That's right.
Yeah. And which is the same for me. I'm from Cape Town as well. And I studied film with Gray, specialized in directing and writing. My passion at university was to, make cerebral, interesting films that were kind of going against the grain of what a lot of our peers at the time were trying to make. They were trying to make genre pieces, and I was really just interested in, kind of emotional, constrained cinema. Which is something that Gray and I both share. And then after university, I went into the film industry for about 6 months, had a whirlwind experience working on a feature film, and got spat out and found my way to Tokyo. We made the feature film in Tokyo. I returned and then actually got involved in the design world, which in turn led me to animation. So while I haven't worked in the live action film industry for a number of years, I still keep up with it, very passionate about it, still write a great deal, and but my primary work now is in the field of animation. For the last year I've been working on a documentary, and I actually handed my last shot for that documentary today.
Congrats. Yeah. I know it's been quite a long process with that. Yeah, it's important that you mentioned we both very much interested in, I guess, the art of film and the art of considered filmmaking.
Yeah, I think, like for years, we kind of watched this YouTube revolution unfold from the sidelines. And, we were both kind of had our head in our hands thinking, God, here goes this beautiful, art form that we love, cinema. But yeah, maybe you can speak a bit about this recent realization we've had that maybe, ironically, we are now in a position where we can kind of bring that passion for cinema back through YouTube,
Yeah, well, that's been a bit of the irony. Whereas in the beginning, I was sort of, I guess, off-put a little by YouTube, or at least the idea that the content on there had to be quite silly and not very serious. But there was, I guess, a recent realization that why not approach it seriously and try to provide the kind of information to people that I would have appreciated the first time I was on a set where I knew nothing.
Yes.
And share some of that knowledge, which is not to say that either of us are oracles of cinema. But it's just...
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. It's just to say that it's something we're both passionate about, and would really like to share with an audience. And if anyone can get anything out of it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that for a moment. I think what you're saying is so important because we live in a world that's very ironic. We live in a world that kind of celebrates silliness and humor and comedy, and I think,
which is valid.
Yeah, look, there's a place for that. But I think what you and I both share is a passion for serious, sincere filmmaking, serious, sincere storytelling that transcends the everyday experience of reality. It transcends irony, and it's genuinely trying to say something meaningful. And I think that what this podcast could potentially offer is a space that treats cinema seriously in that way, that holds it in such high esteem,
Exactly.
Because like I've just said, there's a lot of silliness out there, and we see that on YouTube today. We see a lot of podcasts that are very jokey, very silly, very kind of all over the place sometimes. And sometimes you just want to listen to a podcast that's hones in on the topic and treats it with respect.
Yeah, which sort of brings us, I guess, to the film that we went to go see last night in the cinema.
Yeah.
Which is Tenet by Christopher Nolan, who I think we'd both agree is a director who tends to treat cinema very seriously and tends to treat the subject matter that he deals with in quite a serious and mature manner. He treats his audience, I think definitely after watching Tenet, we could say he treats his audience, he sort of holds them in a high regard. I think he doesn't spoon feed them anything, that's for sure.
Yeah, if anything, he actually challenges the audience. He actually expects sometimes maybe too much from the audience.
I would say so, yeah.
In Tenet, I think that was, one can make a case. Excuse me, I got to put my phone on silent.
And he's usually very good at, I think, pushing the audience to their limit.
Yeah.
In the sense that you usually come out of a Nolan film being challenged and having an understanding of the film, but perhaps thinking, I want to go and rewatch that film so I can better understand the film.
Right.
But I would say, getting straight into Tenet, one of my criticisms was that maybe he pushed that a bit far in his recent film.
Great. I really want to get into this, man, but before we get into it, can I just establish a little bit of a context here?
Sure.
So basically, Tenet is a 2020 action thriller spy film written and directed by Christopher Nolan, and it was produced alongside his wife, Emma Thomas. It's a co-production between the United Kingdom and the United States. It stars John David Washington, who is actually the son of Denzel Washington, in case you didn't know. It stars Robert Pattinson, Elizabeth Debicki, Dimple Kapadia, Michael Caine, and Kenneth Branagh. And I think there's also Aaron Johnson in there. I think that's his name, that army soldier with the beard.
Yes.
The plot follows a secret agent, played by Washington, as he manipulates the flow of time to prevent World War III.
That's the basic synopsis.
Yeah. However, the film itself is not that straightforward. So great. let's get into detail here. What exactly about the film didn't sit well with you? Because that sounds like a great plot.
Yes.
But when we walked out of the cinema, we were quite perplexed.
Yes. Well, I think with most Nolan films, I usually sort of walk in there and expect to be led by an experienced filmmaker. He's the kind of guy where you always feel like he's in control of the film totally, and you're sort of happy to be led by him with the expectation that by the end of the film you'll have a better understanding of the overall a better understanding of the overall plot of the film and the overall sense of what he was trying to achieve. But with this film, I personally just felt at times the plot was so dense
and convoluted,
very convoluted, very dense, that at times it just became difficult to appreciate the film, because at least I was struggling so hard to just work out and what was going on half the time. Yeah,
I think that you and I both share a similar view, which is slightly more negative, let's say. You know, but so before we get into the criticism, proper,
well, we can go over some of the positive sides.
Let's maybe just talk about a bit of the positive side. Personally, I think what I took away from it was I was once again reminded of Nolan's incredible talent and his ability to craft these feats of spectacle, which very few filmmakers can pull off. And I love his dedication to practical in-camera effects. You can feel it. It's a totally different feeling to a Marvel movie or a green screen film.
You really can, especially in today's environment where so much of it is done in VFX. When you do implement practical effects into a film, you really can feel that difference, that marked difference. Yeah. And
I also think that I just love his passion for diversity in the healthy sense. I think diversity can sometimes be, for me personally, a very frustrating thing in cinema, because it sometimes feels like there's a political agenda, and when you're just watching art, you don't want to feel like politics is involved. But somehow, if you think about Inception, if you think about a number of his films, he's got a really effortless way of kind of bringing in characters of different races, different backgrounds together to tell these really interesting stories. Like, again, if you think of Inception, you've got a great diverse set of characters there, and it works. It doesn't feel like you're being hit on the head with anything political.
Well, that's one aspect I liked about the film, was the casting. I thought the casting was very strong. Washington is incredible. He's been in a lot of good movies. I think he's got a super promising career ahead of him.
Especially after this movie.
This will do a lot for him. And one of the biggest things I took away from this in a positive sense was, as you mentioned, these set pieces, these large action set pieces. Like, very few directors are able to tell these kind of large Hollywood set pieces in such an enthralling and captivating way as he does. Like, there really are these moments in the film where you sort of sit back in your seat while you're watching them, and almost, it's a cliche, but you're almost gasping at the scope of it, and at these incredible large stunt sequences.
So I think what the film lacks in, let's say, coherence. I mean, obviously, I think this is something I just want to make very clear, is obviously the story does make sense. Like, if you were to speak to Nolan, he could probably explain the story to you very well. And knowing Nolan and knowing how smart he is, he doesn't just go make a film that doesn't make sense. So while the film has a story which is certainly interesting, I think that the problem is that the way that was communicated, at least on a first impression basis, that it wasn't so effective. Like you've said, it felt convoluted. It felt very rushed in the beginning, and it felt like we were never really given any time to breathe, to relax with the characters. We weren't really given much emotional, let's say, we weren't given an insight into the emotional background of the main character or his motivation. We were kind of just being pulled sort of relentlessly through this incredibly action-packed breakneck story.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And yeah, that comes back to one of my criticisms for the film, which I guess is a pacing issue for me. I think because I guess the goal of the film was, like a lot of spy films, you sort of try and make it very intense and try and keep up an incredible pacing throughout. But even if you look at some James Bond films or bigger films that this to an extent is modeled on, there are always moments in those films where you come down and there's a slowing down of pace and there's a conversation between characters and lets the audience breathe a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I often look at pacing as almost similar to the way we breathe. And quick cuts and fast pacing is almost as if you're hyperventilating, I feel like.
Interesting.
And so there are moments where you can't hyperventilate for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, however long it is. You do need moments where you have to sit back and breathe deeply and take a moment to compose yourself before that frenetic action kicks in again.
Yeah.
And for me, it felt like the pace was just too much and too quick, and we never had a chance to really slow down and take in the story, and that affected the plot. Because as we say, with a very dense plot like this, you need moments where we as an audience can sit back and say, okay, now I understand the setup. Now I'm ready for everything that's going to take place from here on out. Yeah. And for me, that never happened.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think where I personally wanted to see more breathing room was in the setup.
Yes.
I felt like there was very little time given to establish the relationships between characters, to establish again the motivation, the backgrounds, the history, and I know that it's a bit of a meme to kind of constantly refer to Inception, as a bit of a hallmark. But Inception, whether we like it or not, is a great film, and I think that for a lot of Nolan fans and people who are familiar with his work, they were expecting a similar kind of experience, not the same type of film.
Yeah,
maybe obviously a different film, but a similar type of satisfaction.
It was modeled in a similar tone. Yeah, you can see that.
But what Inception got right was that it gave us this wonderful period of breathing space, and it gave us an opportunity to connect with characters, to become familiar with Cobb's team, and then when the mission started kicking off, everything was in place for the audience to be emotionally connected and invested. But I just felt like with this film, it really stretched us. It every time it took this story to a next level, I thought something's missing. I'm entertained on some level because this is very spectacular.
Yeah,
but
totally.
But my heart isn't necessarily in this. And again, Christopher Nolan can say what he wants, but at the end of the day, I think you've got to come to every filmmaker has to come to terms with the fact that the way the audience experiences a movie is really critical. It doesn't matter how good you think the script is. If your audience is not reading it properly, or if your audience is not following you in the way that you intended, something's off.
Yeah.
And I suspect that in the weeks, months, maybe years to come, look, the film could either age well, but I also have a suspicion that people will increasingly say that this was a bit of Nolan kind of dropped the ball here a little bit. And look, that's just my impression at the moment. That could change though.
It could change, yeah. And look, I always admire filmmakers that are bold and that try to tell big stories.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the time with a lot of the movies that are coming out now, a lot of it is quite safe storytelling. Especially within the studio system. So I do admire directors that come forward and try to tell bold, at times complex stories. There's definitely a place for that.
Yes.
But as we say, those stories then just have to be set up properly.
Yeah.
And then it would have been far more successful.
Yeah.
I think something I did really like about it though was the music.
I love the music.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought it worked really well at certain beats. It was quite a heavy soundtrack.
So the music was by Ludwig Göransson.
Yeah, he's done quite a few scores. Very talented musician. So he actually took over from Hans Zimmer, I believe, who is Nolan's regular and who is meant to score this film. But I believe, as far as I know, there was a scheduling conflict.
Okay.
And he took over.
I
thought he did a great job.
Yeah, he's done films like Fruitvale Station, Creed 2, Venom, Black Panther, and also The Mandalorian.
Yeah, and is also a music producer in his own right as well.
Yeah.
I think, though, that does bring us to an issue that we both experienced, which has been I guess you could say a recurring issue, or a recurring point of discussion, at least in Nolan's films, is the sound mix. What did you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that, everyone responds differently to movies. Some people hear things, some people don't. But what seems clear is that our impression when we left the cinema that the sound was slightly off is an opinion that's actually shared by multiple people.
Well, exactly. We weren't sure when we left the cinema if it was just the specific cinema we were in.
Yes.
Where maybe the acoustics weren't quite right, or they hadn't set the audio mix quite right.
Yeah, and what I kept wondering as well was, is it just me? Am I having problems with these accents? Am I having problems picking up the words, the actual dialogue? I mean, for example, there's a character played by Aaron Johnson who plays something of an army captain. Great character, really great look. He's got a great, weight in the film. I love his kind of screen presence.
Yes.
But to be honest, there were many moments where I genuinely had no idea what he was saying because of his thick accent.
And you combine that with...
And he was wearing a mask at times.
He was wearing a mask.
And which makes you think about The Dark Knight Rises. And that's what people have been saying in some of these reviews. Like, it can't be a coincidence. There's something going on in the sound mix studio of Nolan's films that's not right.
Well, I think... For me, what it is, and maybe what he's trying to do, is to create a really immersive experience by mixing all the environmental sounds very loud and the music very loud, and which totally works. But where it doesn't work is where, again, you have a very clear plot and you need to be fed certain information.
Particularly a plot like Tenet's plot.
Yes.
I mean, if ever there's a plot where you need to hear the dialogue, it's Tenet.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's the point. It's look, like you say, if a filmmaker wants to be creative with the audio mix, by all means go ahead. But when it comes to a film like Tenet, which demands absolute attention from the audience, and I mean, you can't allow lines, particularly. I mean, I had the sense that there was a particular point when they were talking about inversion. It was when they were entering that machine, that inverted time, that kind of cylindrical, big rotating machine. It was a beautiful sequence of events that period, right? And very dramatic with Kenneth Branagh coming in and out there, But the problem was the captain there, Aaron Johnson's character, when he was explaining things, I honestly could not follow him.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was such a fumble, because here you have this sort of critical piece of machinery in the film which allows them to invert time.
Yes.
And we're missing the dialogue. We can't actually follow along.
Yeah. And again, it comes down to the setup. We need to understand how this setup works in order for the final act to pay off, really.
Yeah.
Because if we don't understand the setup, then it's kind of all for nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, something else, I quite enjoyed the cinematography in the film. I have to say I wasn't blown away by it, but I thought it was very solid. It was like a lot of the cinematography in other Nolan films. So it was shot by Hoyte van Hoytema. They shot it in large format film. So it had a very fine grain, beautiful color to it. But it was quite, I guess deliberately, I would almost describe it as quite plain and quite everyday. The production design was very normal. It wasn't too stylized. It was quite realistic in a sense.
Yeah.
Lighting was very natural.
Like any great spy movie, it's not trying to be too much. It's trying to actually be gritty and real.
Yes. And I guess it was successful in that regard, because it was trying to serve the story by being gritty and real and and not distracting at all from what is happening on screen.
I think one of the things I appreciated from the cinematography was just the sense of grandeur and scope, which is always a nice aspect to a great spy film. There's a sense that you're dealing in a world of great wealth, great consequence. You're dealing in a world with big characters, big money, and with this beautiful shots of that super yacht. Yeah. These beautiful shots of these
helicopter shots.
Yeah, the stunning helicopter shots in the mountains with these gigantic, helicopters with dual propellers. I think that Nolan has a great ability to really create this awe-inspiring sense of scale and grandeur. Yeah. He really, and I think he's following in the tradition of the blockbuster films he grew up on.
Yes,
where they took the average person from any small neighborhood and they revealed this huge world that you could only experience in a movie.
Yeah. And when you're dealing with this kind of budget, I do like the fact that they used quite traditional established film technology. Yeah. So all those overhead shots were shot clearly on a helicopter, not with a drone.
Yes.
And you really can feel it. You get a sense of movement from a helicopter that you just can't get with a drone. So I love that they made those kind of decisions as well. It really added to the big sort of blockbuster effect of the film.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Why don't we start wrapping up?
Sure.
I think to conclude, I just want to say that while we both share our criticisms and concerns with the film, personally, as a filmmaker myself, I also understand that not every film will be perfect, and that we as viewers need to respect the fact that it's very much an experiment, part of Christopher Nolan's own personal filmmaking journey.
Yeah. And
that while it's frustrating maybe to not hear dialogue here or not understand the plot there, we've also got to understand that, this is an artist and he's trying new things. He's pushing boundaries and he's trying to figure things out. And I think it's cool that we live in a world where someone like Nolan has the freedom and the budget to really let their imagination run wild. I mean, we live in a imagine for example, like so many filmmakers out there, he wasn't able to do this. The world would be kind of a little deficient because I think we get a lot out of his imagination.
Yeah. And in a world really of Marvel movies and sequels and
yes,
and that's where all the big budget films are structured around a traditional model based on how much money they can make. It really is refreshing to see original content. And I'll always appreciate filmmakers who are trying to produce big budget, large scale original content. And I'll always support that filmmaking.
Yeah. And we have to acknowledge that it's arguably one of the most difficult things you can do in filmmaking is to create original blockbusters. How on earth he pulls it off and he continues to pull it off, it's still beyond me. So yes, despite the problems with sound, despite the convoluted plot and the lack of breathing space, I personally loved the grandeur, the scale, the beautiful visuals. I also really appreciated the performances, even though I don't think the characters were set up in an optimal way. Yes. I really enjoyed watching Robert Pattinson interact with Washington.
They played off each other quite nicely.
I thought there were some great little characters like that guy who crashed the plane.
Yes,
I would have loved to have gotten to know him a bit more
backstory.
I thought Kenneth Branagh was a very convincing bad guy.
He was really good. Yeah, I actually really enjoyed his performance.
Often with these bad guys, they can be a bit conventional and a bit dry because they've been done so much. Sort of the classic Russian evil baddie.
Yes,
but I just felt like Nolan went far in trying to communicate to the audience this guy's emotional background and his motivation, which was basically that he'd experienced this trauma growing up. His hometown had been destroyed, and as a result, he was very bitter and didn't want to really share any of his wealth, and wanted to see the world go down with him.
Yes,
in a nutshell. Yeah. Let's see, and then I think as well that I also liked, in a strange way, I kind of enjoyed the feeling of not necessarily knowing what was going on. I don't think that cinema is something that we should expect to always understand. I think that the experience of watching Tenet and being confused in and of itself is an experience.
Is an experience, exactly.
And it'll take another viewing, I think, for the story to set in. And maybe that's kind of the point with Nolan's work.
That's part of the process, maybe. Maybe it's for the audience as well. Yeah.
And look, we can argue all day about, whether that's right or wrong. But the bottom line is, it seems like that's just the reality of this latest film. It's something that demands a second viewing.
Yeah.
And it's something that's definitely demands your full attention. And while it does have its faults for me, I'm a big fan of Nolan and I believe in him, and I trust that his next film will hopefully make up for the problems that we've experienced with this film.
Totally, I'm sure he will. Cool. So to round it out, maybe we should talk just very briefly about what we're planning on doing with this podcast. So I think in the future we're going to try and do these more regularly, where we talk about everything that's both from a personal point of view as well as from a movie point of view, perhaps movies we've seen recently, and reflect on them. Yeah,
so my idea is that we talk about films we've just watched. We talk about videos that you or I are making. So for example, right now I think you're putting together a video on
Sean Bobbitt,
right? The cinematographer. And I'm just wrapping up a documentary. I'm going to start producing the films for Depth Cine. And so, we'll have conversations about films that we've watched, the films we're making for our channels. We can also talk about books that we've read or articles we've read, and really just anything related to film.
And the art of cinema.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Greg.
Cool. Thanks, Greg.
And until next time, guys,
this has been In Depth Film. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.